glad to open this session with Annette Becker, Sven Reichardt, and Omer Bartov. Annette Becker is a professor emerit of cultural history of wars at the University of Paris-Nanterre. After focusing mostly on the Great War, its commemoration, on the return of the soldiers, the humanitarian aspect and trauma, Becker has been working on the links between the two world wars, especially on the many aspects of the occupation, on the forms of violence that were inherited from one to the other, and on the extraordinary innovation when it came to horror during World War II. In particular, she has become a specialist on genocide with her work on Lemkin, from the Armenians to Holocaust to the Tutsi of Rwanda. She focuses on artists, writers, intellectuals at war, and on history, museum where war violence and mass crimes are shown, or sometimes instrumentalized by dark tourism. Last published book, Voir la Grande Guerre, Un autre récit, 2014. A Messenger of Disaster, Raphael Lemkin, Jan Karski, and the 20th Century Genocide, for the University of Wisconsin Press, 2021, but is already appeared for Fayard in 2018. L'immontrable de the guerre and the violence extreme dans art and literature, in 2021 as well. De Juifs trahis par leur France, 1939-1944, Gallimard, 2024. Et Le Choc, le génocide de Tutsi de Rwanda, 1994, Gallimard, 2024. Please, Annette.
In his essay, Wars of the 20th Century and the 20th Century as War, the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka fully grasped the paradoxical nature of the conflict. You have it on the screen. The Great War was indeed a total global tragedy. Its setting, the entire world, its main feature, mass violence. From the very beginning, the imperial powers made the war global by pulling the inhabitants and resources of their empires into the war. This took place long before the United States entered the war in 1917. Countries, whether neutral or not, helped maintain the scale of the violence through industrialized productions of munitions, food, and other supplies, while also seeking to uphold as much of the law of war as it could. Although the war officially ended in 1918, in some ways it continued into the 20s and actually lasted right to the Second World War. What began in Europe and might have been only the Third Balkan War was turned into a global catastrophe upon the whim of the great imperial powers. For them, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia were destroyed by it. The world would come to mourn the death of an unknown numbers of civilians and 10 million combatants, and the loss of an innocence never to be regained. It will leave a vivid scar on the collective memory of all involved. For 100 years now, the military fronts and those who fought on them have received the most attention. I think it's time to study everyone else's war. The military fronts and the home fronts formed an immense complex war machine. There were fronts on land, sea and air, and sites of invasion and shelter, fronts of labor, of military and civilian imprisonment, of battles against wounds and disease, and of mourning, obviously. This sowed the seeds of later catastrophes. In some areas, civilians were at the heart of the war, invaded, occupied, looted, and bombed. They had become target in this war. Authorities in charge tested their ideas of how to repress large groups, displace entire population, even attempt, in the words of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the systematic extermination of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. Emmanuel Levinas, a philosopher who has been exiled from his country for the first time in 1914, recalled later, after the unrest, which never stopped the disturbances. The Great War, actually, whether deliberately or unconsciously, was a laboratory for the 20th century and probably for the 21st. A field experiment or test where violence could be carried out and you could measure your effectiveness on military material and men. The weapons became increasingly sophisticated. The white-coated technicians were sometimes located right at the front. When poison gas was deployed on a massive scale for the first time, Fritz Haber, a German chemist, was on the battlefield at Ypres to observe the consequences of his finding. Psychologists set up laboratories as close as possible to the action to use war as an extended experiment where men were serving as lab rats. Total war meant globalization and industrialization, modernization and regression, anomia and cultural appropriation across regions, countries, and continents. As we already said this morning, facts and statistics are needed on an enormous scale to assess this kind of violence. But geography nor statistic bleed. I believe it is possible to show the extreme of violence, and I will follow George Mosse in 1963, saying, the human was defined through aesthetic criteria, spiritual criteria, the human soul. I follow George and think it still remains to us to force the corners of literature, philosophy, and art into the bloody military home front, occupation, pogroms, and acts of cruelty. Thinkers, intellectuals, and artists share what was called the mental equipment of everyone and participated in real time and long after, till now, to the public shaping of things. The Great War opened a number of paradoxes which are far to be closed. Mosse spoke of the pre-industrial nostalgia of fascists just out of the Great War, when 1914-23, with the wars and violence going on, especially on the Eastern and Southeastern Europe, was industrial at its core. And what about the humanitarian laws, so central since the 19th century, and the reaction to violation of these laws with paradoxes inside the paradoxes? In 1913, one French doctor explained very seriously that the humanitarian bullets were powerful enough to stop the enemy, but sufferings inflicted were nothing. The main paradox is that everyone has reconstructed a story in spite of the topos of the untransmissible or the inaudible. Generally, both consenting and suffering, the witnesses require us, like all historical subjects, to historicize that which initially seemed unable to historicization. As we know through Karen Blixen, all sorrows can be born if you put them in a story or tell a story about them. Hannah Arendt took this sentence again and again. If in history, and especially in this kind of war, there is only chaos and chance, we have to try as historians to identify the chaos and paradoxes of this history. And obviously the interwar generation failed to see how irradiated the war and the post-war had been given to the world. They were unable to see how deeply and irreversibly affected they were by its brutalization. George, again. So I do it in 3 parts. One part on military fronts, quickly, because it is the most well-known, even if it is the most violent. Then the civilian fronts, and I end by a reflection on mass violence and the invention of the word genocide out of the First World War. In 1914, all the belligerents hoped for a short conflict, wishing often in a militarist tone that it might put an end to the very idea and war. Even in 1917, President Wilson could still speak of the war to end all war. But the conflict, modern and industrial to the highest degree, had soon combined cannon and then gas, aircraft, tanks, and so on. But in the same time, it returned to the most primitive times with attacks on civilians. We will go with the term coined by Hindenburg or Ludendorff of the battle of materials to describe the battles, but the soldiers described it as devastation or butchery. But they were both right. It was, in the same time, a battle of material and an utter carnage. All had been frightening in the past, but it was more than over the case with the gas, by example, like you see on these Canadian soldiers and Panther. Nevertheless, and it is so important for the thinking about violence, most of the combatants initially found an inspiration in the spectacle of war, expressed here by the painter Fernand Léger. There was an over-poetic atmosphere in the front. It taught me more for my evolution as a visual artist and as a man than all the museums in the world. So all oscillated between fascination with the war and its violence, and also the shock of the horror. And you have all the time this kind of ambiguity. It is like if there were suddenly all the heirs of Marinetti, who spoke about the hygiene of war in 1909, and you can see it obviously here in paintings by Severini, where the exhibit in the National Galleria has not understood that war was important for the futurists, but here they are, and obviously this it finishes by Mussolini's "War must reveal Italy to Italians" in February 1915, just before Italy entered the war. What is the most interesting in this kind of strange war? It is this kind of invisibility that the poet Guillaume Apollinaire said so well in his poem. There are Hindus who view Western landscape with astonishment, and you have this camouflage with gas mask. They come from India. They have no idea where they are, but they know they are fighting this strange war. And I think this invisibility, which has been taken so far, it's exactly what happened during this time. But obviously, it finishes into violent despair, all kinds of wounds, as you can see. And even if a Jesuit treasure bearer will become one of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century, Teilhard de Chardin, was saying, "The front enchants me." The enchanting was quickly finish. And it finishes into this death and void. Here, British Panthers at the front, in ambulances, British and German again, and it finishes into trauma. And in a way, trauma, as George Mosse in a very nice, important conference we had together about craziness at war, said that the war is craziness and trauma is the war. And there was some psychiatrist specialist who thought it was a little bit exaggerated, but I still is. I stay with George, because the damage, the psychiatric damage done to so many soldiers and so many civilians, as you can see on the left on this Devant Bay in Arras, which has been the main characteristic, actually, of this violence on the battlefield. And finally, the end was the death. George Mosse, had his last book on the Great War called Fallen Soldiers, only in 1990. And it was a time when I was lucky enough to visit battlefields and museums with him. And definitely my intellectual world would not be the same without these years of companionship with him. I remember a visit at Verdun, who was very memorable. And what he did in this last book, he described so well, mainly for Germany and Italy, what meant the sanctification of the sacrifice on the battlefield, with all the different civic cults in cemeteries which were built as heroes' gardens. Even if it was minored by trivialization, another of his great inventions. And so he was not far when he was describing that from the poet Apollinaire, who, even before the war, wrote this book called The Murder Poet, where he anticipates the burial of a poet, and it could be also all the combatants of the war, Apollinaire being himself wounded during the war. So for him and for Mosse, these combatants in a way have been becoming ghosts. Ghosts as all the unknown soldiers, so many of them. When the cult of the unknown soldier was born at the time, it's no accident. And could you come to everyday life, the one who survived, or was it impossible? The discussion has been going on till now. I will quote to finish this part the Walter Benjamin. For him, the generation of 1914-1918 had to experience one of the most monstrous events in the history of the world. And he insisted particularly on the tiny, fragile human body in the middle of this immense tragedy. That's why he wrote a desperate criticism of the collective work directed by Ernst Jünger, Krieg und Krieger. For Jünger, the 19th century progress of civilization twinned to the heroic spirit and led to total mobilization. Benjamin, in his theories of German fascism, engaged specifically with Jünger. For him, the war was lost for the Germans when Jünger spoke only about heroism, which was for him the real German victory. These fascist texts by Benjamin are obviously a great example of the brutalization of the German society from 1914 onward. But it was met by bluntness, which became reality at the Versailles Peace Conference especially in the Article 231 and 232 of the treaty, when the Allies accused Germany of everything in the war. In a way, a guilty Germany had to make material reparation, physical, but obviously for them, it meant also something moral. And here we are about morality in violence and war. Clemenceau was the head of this idea. And it is not just a question of material reparation. The need for moral reparation is just as great. Perhaps it is why the Italians, who also pretended to moral reparation and who pretended to believe in morality, at least the more militant of them, they had signed the condemnation of Germany, but they could not accept the treason of the Allies about the territorial promises of the war. Is this why it gave way to the fascist, but not only, interpretation of the mutilated peace? What neither Benjamin nor Junger, nor the fascists, nor Clemenceau, neither the historian till the 90s had really understood. It was that certain civilians had their own fair share of frenzy, and perhaps were even more than the soldiers at the core of the war of extreme violence. So it will be my second part, civilian, genders, and race, from military to domestic front. The cartoonist Cesare, an American cartoonist from Italian origin, gave in 1916 this drawing, which is typical of the male soldier-oriented vision of the war. You can see a battlefield full of corpses in uniform near a home where hopeless women and children cry, labeled, those died for those to live. It will take time to understand the civilians were now main target in the total war. At first, contemporary concentrated particularly on atrocities committed by their enemy. The representation of atrocities became the only way of representing the conflict, which each child accusing the other of barbarism. The reality is that the conflict was from the start symbolized by real atrocities against civilians on all fronts. In the mind, there was a mix of real atrocities, exaggeration, and rumor, which was passed by refugees. And the refugees, you have here refugees painted by Lavian painter, have been really the first figure and the last figure of the war. I would say they were a center of the war. These men, women, and children, when they did find refuge, attracted various reactions, the best and worst of societies during war. First, there was care and concern in the first month, and then more and more, they were rejected. They were extra mouths to feed, and they did not have always a different nationality. There was interned refugees in a lot of countries, like France or Italy, but they were seen actually as alien. They could not be integrated to society. And the perspective shifted quickly from refugees coming from somewhere else to refugees being different by something else. In the language of the day, that meant race. You have other refugees or fugitive, like in the Hungarian case of this great Hungarian painter, Gyula. And you have a painting which is in the exhibit now of Primo Conti, Profughe alla stazione, except they don't say it has something to do with the First World War in the exhibit. Which was much worse was the internal reorganization for suspect population. And it reached its worst in Russia. You have it here with Abel Pan drawing, speaking about this ethnic cleansing which took place in Russia. These internal refugees, these Jews, and also Russian from German origin, were now deportees. A wave of pogroms coincided with other widespread violence by combatants against Jews, nourished by long-held ideas, not very new, the Jew as a traitor and a speculator. But what was new is that the authorities' orders not to prosecute people could have a crack at the Yid with impunity, and many regular units in the Russian army committed war crimes against the Jews. These waves of anti-Semitic violence continued on a massive scale between 1918 and 1920s. I will come back to it when I speak about Lemkin in my conclusion. What to do with all these civilians and this strange way of treating them? The president of the Red Cross Committee was totally helpless in 1917. They didn't know what to do with them, and they even didn't know how to give a name to them. What was happening to them? They were internees, they were deportees, they were prisoners. There was no international treaty to protect them. Obviously, the normal war always involved violent separation of civilians from soldiers. But for the soldiers, you have the elation of heroism and sometimes the consent. There is nothing. And since they didn't know how to name them, there was even no mention of what was happening, no mention of gender or of age. They could not understand what it was. And the paradox that these civilians were in camps, and that the landscape of the Great War, this is typical Great War. You don't know about it, but it is typical Great War. There was these watchtowers and this electrified barbed wire everywhere where the war was fought. And they were, at times, like in Holzminden, very modern, electrified. But in a world in which heroes were dying on the battlefield, very few paid attention to that. They were practically invisible. As in Cuba, 1896, South Africa, German West Africa, 1904, deportation had become synonymous with concentration camps. And because Europeans had immediately made the war total by attacking other countries' colonies, these camps were also open for enemy alliance in all the different colonies. Here you have them marked as it should be in Australia and in New Zealand. This is really a world war, especially for that. First men are the main targets. Why do they intern men? Because they could go to war and they could be dangerous. But often enough and soon enough, the population of the areas who had been invaded, they did not know either to do something with them. They wanted to isolate them, or they use them as hostages. These women from the north of France are deported to Low Saxony to force the French government to do something after a battle in front of Haifa in Palestine. So you have this kind of thing, which shows, obviously, the World War, which shows that the violence is now something which can attend anybody, anywhere, in the fighting country. The other could be taken for forced labor. Forced labor during the time is a return to a kind of slavery. This horror of total war against civilians was particularly acutely observed by German painters who have been occupiers in Belgium, by example, or in Austria and in Serbia. So I show you here Otto Dix because I think he's the one who has shown the best. With all his skill, the drawings he did at war were much more atrocious than the etching he did after the war. And I think his etching can be seen as really the laboratories of this violence I'm trying to convey to you. And this shows what the German writer Wirbücher called the bloodiest and most disturbing enigma in history. But it had still to find a name. If massacres of Armenians had already happened since the end of the 19th century, it was under cover of the Great War that the Young Turks were able to complete their project of the destruction of the ethnic diversity of the Ottoman Empire in the name of racial homogenization and religious purity. Two stages in this annihilation. You see, I don't use the word genocide in purpose. First, the men, and second, women, children, families torn apart. These trends are very notorious because they are trained for sheep, and there is 3 levels of sheep, and it's impossible for men to be there except like being a sheep. This slaughter site also was taken in photo by German photographer Armin Wagner, who was in the German army and was courageous enough to take photographs. I have no time to go more about him. This destruction of Armenians was physical, kill them, biological, kill their children so they will not have any more Armenian on earth, and cultural. It went to with the destruction of churches and libraries in an attempt to wipe out thousands of years of culture. In 1917, the poet Jean Cocteau, hearing jazz like here for the first time, when an African-American band reached Europe, he called it a tame catastrophe. I would say that the conflict, in a way, could be an untamed and untamable catastrophe, or rather, a tragedy. In a tragedy, it could be blood, but it can be nobility and horror. At the front, it could be both. That's why so many remain fascinated by the irrationality of violence and wanted to go on in different ways. One of the ways will be this one, Otto Dix again. Otto Dix, with his painting of 1920, Prager Straße, Dresden, it's absolutely full of the after-war contrast. It shows window shop, which are full of sexuality. Sorry about the bad quality, but Stuttgart Museum doesn't want to give better prints. And you have to steal it. And which is interesting for such a painting. And it shows this after-life contrast. Sexuality, the guy who is a beggar, and among them, a very elegant gentleman with a hat and without legs, so no sexuality also, but with the Iron Cross on his jacket. So he's very proud to be a veteran. And he received a newspaper from a dog, and as you can see, it's written on the newspaper. We are in 1920, Juden raus. I would say that Dada and Expressionism were in advance, as it is normal for artists and writers. But soon enough, Dix and his equal, much more if they were Jewish, like George Gross or Otto Freundlich, will be labeled degenerate. When the Nazis organized their exhibition in 1937 in München, they used one of the ironic devices that had been written on the wall of the Dadaist Fair in 1920. Take Dada seriously, it's worth it. They took the message seriously, literally, showing the works of art for the last time, like the self-portrait and mutiles by Otto Dix. What they could not stand were the mutiles, and also could work at 45%. It was a place where you can have a pension in Germany, where the Nazi and a lot of other Germans who were not Nazi would still 5 minutes, okay, would still see as heroism and suffering all the other could not take in. But they owed everything at the rupture of the Great War. So this was for racism. Too bad, I have no time.
Okay, 1 minute more.
No, that will, never mind. So it will be the coda, and I need 5 minutes for that. From the Great War to Raphael Lemkin's concept of genocide. Henri Verbucher, I already quote, said that the worst, what happened during the Great War, was not the huge battle on the fronts, but was the extermination of the Armenian. In August 1941, a very important speech was broadcasted by Churchill about the mass murder of the Nazis in Soviet Union. He said, "We are in the presence of a crime without a name." Somebody will give it a name, Raphael Lemkin. What did it mean at the time when he thought the word genocide? The concept was gestated over an extensive time between 1920 and the 30s in Europe, and formulated in 1943, as you have here, when he wrote the chapter 9 of his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. He titled the chapter Genocide with a singular, but genocides with an S was always in his mind. The origin of his thought, all the First World War, especially 2 times in the war, the pogroms and the deportation of the Russian Jews, plus the pogroms during the revolution and after he witnessed himself in Lviv, and the Armenian annihilation. So he worked on that. And in 1933, he was ready to present a report to the Society of Nations International Conference in Madrid, where he could not go by himself because of anti-Semite Poland did not let go. But the book was there. And it is where he showed to the world for the first time the word barbarism, destroying a national or religious collectivity, and the notion of vandalism, destruction of works of culture, which represented, he said, the specific genius of this group. In 1945, this word could not be accepted at Nuremberg. But it was lost. It was not lost by an Armenian, Shavash Mesakian, because it was the 30th anniversary of the extermination of the Armenian. This exiled survivor, who had a newspaper in Paris, was the first man in the world to use, outside of Lemkin's prose, the word genocide. Disaster, massacre, mass killing, they were innocent words to characterize this catastrophe, as the word got better from Istanbul, Malta, and to Nuremberg, Berlin, and Auschwitz. Misakian, like Lemkin and a few others, had this incredibly modern political and psychological insight. They opened from their experiences and thinking a new way to understand history. For us historians, above the legal and court implication, above Nuremberg and the International Justice Court, above denial. And from them, especially from Lemkin, we can draw an historical, sociological, and anthropological typology of war, genocide, and different fascism or not. I will skip the part on the genocide itself, and I skip especially Himmler's speech because I think Omer wants to speak about it, and certainly most of you know that. But I would say that the way Lemkin spoke about the physical, the biological, and the cultural genocide, it is so important for us today to understand what happened in the past and to understand what is going on or not going on in the moment. Today, we have post-memory thinking, and we know that the terrors of war and genocide move through all generations, particularly because the genocide breaks apart the basic unit, the family. And what happened during the two world wars about Armenians and Jews and Gypsies, I think can be carried on about heroes and namas at the turn of the 20th century, Ukrainians in the 30s, Cambodians, Bosniaks, Tutsi of Rwanda, and I think a case can be made now for Yazidis and Rohingyas. Let's stop here and realize that genocide has become, in the last 20 years, a kind of highest grade on the scale of sufferings, as if war violence was not enough, and it was not enough for warriors and perpetrators. I am sure of it. Thank you.